heard the words before I clearly saw her face. Probably just some trash the water washed up. The voice drifted from the side of the road, carried on the biting wind that whipped across the frozen ground and mixed with the slow, steady clop of my horse's hooves. The morning was gray as ash. The snow from the night before had fallen lightly, coating the path through the open grasslands in a thin, dirty white layer. I was riding my black stallion back from the southern fields to my farmstead on the edge of Mirewood after checking the fences and the half-starved cattle that had barely survived the first half of winter. My name is Garin Holt. I have lived alone for so long that I no longer count time by seasons, but by which barn roof I have repaired, which oak has fallen, and which horse has grown old. My house stands outside the town of Briar Fen, far enough that I don't have to listen to the town's gossip every night, but close enough to trade pelts, rough wool, and salted butter for nails, barley, or lamp oil when I need them. I don't like crowds. I don't like tavern talk. I don't like people asking why a healthy man chooses to live like a shadow on the edge of the fields. I work, I eat, I sleep, and I keep my land from dying along with the winter. But that day on the road home, something would not let me ride past as usual. By the roadside, near a shallow frozen ditch, an orc woman had collapsed. She must have tried to keep walking because the footprints in the thin snow were not straight, but staggering, leaving long, dragging trails stained with blood. Her feet were bare. The hem of her ragged skirt was torn to shreds. Her dark brown hair was matted against her face and neck as if the wind had beaten her through the entire night. The thin cloak on her body was ripped so badly it could no longer hold any warmth. Her lips were blue, her shoulders shaking in short, violent spasms, as if the simple act of staying alive was her final battle. What angered me was not only her condition, it was the group of people standing not far away. 5 or 6 townsfolk from Briar Fen on their way to the early market had formed a loose circle close enough to stare far enough that they didn't have to help. A woman, wrapped in a gray scarf, stood with her arms crossed over her chest. 2 men held bundles of firewood. An old cart driver had pulled his reins aside as if afraid the fallen woman might touch his wheels. No one stepped forward. They only watched. They watched the way people look at a broken thing discarded by the roadside. I reined in my horse. I said nothing at first. I looked at them, then at the orc woman struggling to lift her head. She must have heard the hooves because she forced her eyes open. Those eyes were a deep, dark brown clouded with fever and exhaustion, but there was still something in them that refused to die completely. Something like pride that had been trampled many times but had not yet been crushed entirely. "Is no one going to help?" I asked. No one answered right away. Finally, the cart driver shrugged. Who knows where she came from? She might bring trouble with her. The woman with the scarf added, "She looks like trash. Taking her in would only bring harm to your house." I looked back at the woman on the ground. She must have heard every word because her eyelids trembled and a single tear mixed with dirt slid slowly down her frozen cheek. "They call me trash," she whispered. Her voice was so hoarse it nearly disappeared into the wind. "Everywhere. They call me that." I dismounted. I didn't go to her first. I walked straight toward the group of onlookers. Get lost. One word, not loud, but cold enough. The cart driver smiled faintly as if he wanted to argue, but when he saw I wasn't looking away, the smile died in his throat. They weren't afraid of right and wrong, but they knew me. They knew I wasn't the kind of man who spoke on the road and forgot the moment I turned my back. One by one, they avoided my eyes and scattered like crows hit by stones. When the road was empty again, I knelt beside her. She was lighter than I expected. Not because she was small, but because hunger and cold had taken nearly all the weight from her body. When I gently turned her shoulder to see her face, her breathing was frighteningly shallow. Her forehead burned with fever. Her wrists were scraped raw. Her bare feet were torn and bleeding from walking on ice and frozen stones. Her skin was a pale, sickly green, the color of orcs who had been starved and beaten for too long. Small tusks protruded from her lower lip, one of them chipped. Her long dark hair was tangled and caked with blood and dirt. "What's your name?" I asked quietly. She opened her mouth and struggled for a moment before the sound came out rough as stone Maela. Maela. I took out my water flask, poured a little on a cloth, and gently wiped her cracked lips. "Listen to me. I don't know what happened to you, but if you stay out here much longer, you will die." She looked at me with eyes full of distrust and exhaustion. She had been refused help so many times that she no longer expected kindness from anyone. "I have nothing to give you," she said. Those words struck me harder than anything else. Not, "Please save me," but "I have nothing to give you." I slid my arms under her back and knees and lifted her from the snow as carefully as I could. She was light, fragile, like a bundle of dry branches on the verge of snapping. "I didn't ask for payment," I told her. She flinched slightly in my arms, the instinctive reaction of someone who had been touched without permission too many times. But the fever and exhaustion kept her from fighting back. I placed her on my horse's back, mounted behind her, wrapped my arms around her to keep her from falling, and turned the horse toward my farmstead. Behind us, the wind continued to sweep across the dirty white road. Ahead, the thin trail of smoke from my chimney rose against the cold gray sky. In my arms was an orc woman whom the entire town had called trash. And right then, even though I knew almost nothing about her, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. From this day forward, I would no longer return to that house alone. The road from where I found my Ayla to my farmstead felt longer than usual. It wasn't the wind or the horse's pace. It was the way she kept slipping in and out of consciousness in my arms. One moment her head would drop heavily against my chest, her breathing shallow and ragged. The next, she would jerk awake, body tensing as if expecting a blow. Each time she stirred her green skin pale and dull from cold, and hunger brushed against my coat, and I felt the heat of her fever burning through the thin fabric of her torn cloak. I kept one arm locked around her waist and the other on the reins, guiding the stallion along the frozen path. Her dark hair matted with blood and dirt tickled my chin. One of her small tusks pressed lightly against my shoulder whenever she leaned forward. She was lighter than she should have been for an orc woman, all sharp bones and exhaustion. I had seen orcs before, strong, proud warriors who sometimes passed through Briar Fen on their way north, but never one broken like this. The old storage shed beside the barn was the first place I took her. I didn't bring her straight into the main house, not yet. The shed was warmer, closer to the animals' heat, and easier to watch through the night if the fever worsened. I had used it for years to store hay and mend harnesses, but 2 winters ago I had boarded half of it into a rough sleeping space for nights when blizzards killed the fire in the main hearth. It would do for now. I eased her down onto the clean straw I had spread earlier that morning. She barely stirred. I built up the fire in the small iron stove until the flames roared and pushed the chill back into the corners. Then I fetched water-clean rags and the pouch of bitter herbs I kept for the cattle. I crushed the leaves with a little mutton fat and made a paste to draw out the fever. When I touched her wrists to clean the raw scrapes, she flinched hard even in her sleep, pulling away like a cornered animal. I spoke low, the same tone I used with skittish colts. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't answer, but her breathing eased a fraction. I left a bowl of water, half a loaf of dark bread, and a wedge of hard cheese on an upturned crate beside her. Then I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, giving her the only thing I could offer that night space. I crossed the frozen yard to the main house, lit the lantern, and sat at the table with a cold supper I barely tasted. The wind howled across the thatch. For the first time in years, the silence inside my walls felt different. It felt incomplete. Near midnight, I carried an extra blanket back to the shed. The door was still cracked open the way I had left it. The water bowl was half empty. A corner of the bread was gone. I set the blanket on the chair and left without a word. Morning came gray and cold. When I pushed the shed door open, Maela was awake. She sat with her back against the wooden wall, knees drawn up, the new blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. In her right hand, she gripped a jagged piece of wood she had sharpened against the stove's edge during the night. Her dark eyes locked on me the moment I stepped inside. They were clear now, but still full of warning. I stopped in the doorway and kept my hands visible. Feeling any better, she didn't answer right away. Her gaze flicked from my face to the bowl of warm oat porridge and fresh milk I carried, then back to me. "You didn't throw me out," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steadier than the day before. "I brought you here yesterday. Others change their minds faster." I set the food on the crate, then stepped back to the door again, giving her room. "My name's Garin." She stared at the porridge for a long time before she reached for it. She ate slowly, deliberately, tearing small pieces of bread and dipping them in the milk so none would be wasted. I recognized the habit of someone who had gone hungry often enough to fear the next meal might never come. After a few bites, she spoke again. "Why did you bring me here? I was riding past. Others rode past, too. I didn't like them." That drew the smallest flicker across her face, something that might have been surprise or the ghost of a smile. She kept eating. When the bowl was empty, she set it down carefully and looked straight at me. "I have nothing to pay you with. I already told you I wasn't asking for payment." She studied me the way a wounded wolf studies an open hand. Then in a voice so low it almost disappeared into the crackle of the fire, she gave me the rest of her story. She'd been sold 3 times. First as a child to a merchant caravan, then traded north when the old owner died, and finally passed to a man named Rovek Hale, who treated her like livestock, something to haul goods warm his bed when he felt like it, and be beaten when she spoke back. She had run during the last journey, slipping away in the night and walking for 2 days without rest or food. The cold had nearly killed her before I found her. When she finished, she looked at the floor. "They call me trash," she said again, quieter this time, "everywhere I go." I leaned against the doorframe and let the silence sit between us for a moment. "Maela," I said, using her name for the first time since she had given it to me. "Stay here, not just until the snow melts. Not until you're strong again. Stay. Live in this house with me." She lifted her head so fast her tusks caught the firelight. "You're mad. Maybe. You don't even know what I am. I know you were dying in the snow and no one else cared. I know you ate half the bread and left the rest for later. I know you woke up first thing and made yourself a weapon instead of asking for help. That's enough for me to offer you a roof." She stared at me for a long time. The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved across the frozen fields. "And if I bring trouble," she asked, "then I'll deal with it." Her shoulders dropped a fraction. She closed her eyes once, as if swallowing something heavy in her chest. When she opened them again, the wariness was still there, but something else had shifted behind it, something tired and fragile and almost hopeful. "I don't know how to be kept," she whispered. "I'm not keeping you," I said. "I'm asking you to stay." Maela looked around the small shed at the clean straw, the warm stove, the blanket I had brought in the night. Then she looked back at me. For the first time since I had lifted her from the snow, she didn't flinch when our eyes met. The house that had stood empty of any other living soul for years now held 2 heartbeats instead of 1. And though neither of us said it aloud, we both understood the same quiet truth. From that morning on, nothing in my life would ever be the same again. The 3 days after that passed in a silence that was neither heavy nor easy. Maella stayed in the old shed beside the barn. I didn't ask her to move into the main house. She needed the walls between us, and I needed to prove that the door was open but not a trap. Each morning I left food on the threshold, warm porridge milk, a chunk of bread. Each evening the bowls came back clean. Sometimes I heard her quiet coughing behind the wooden planks. Sometimes I heard the scrape of a broom or the soft clink of a bucket as she carried water for the animals. She never asked permission, she simply did what needed doing. On the fourth morning, I returned from checking the cattle to find the yard swept clean of the night's fresh snow. The broken handle on the shovel I had meant to mend for weeks had been bound tight with fresh leather strips and a new wooden peg. My heavy coat, which I had thrown across the chair the night before, now hung neatly on the hook by the door. I stood there for a long moment staring at the small, careful changes. It wasn't the work itself. It was the way she had made herself useful without being told. The way she had taken a corner of my life that had been mine alone and quietly left her mark on it. That evening, I stepped into the main house and found a pot already simmering on the stove. Beans, wild greens, I had forgotten I still had a few bones from the smokehouse. The smell was plain and warm, the kind a house in winter should carry. Mila sat at the far end of the table, hands folded in her lap, watching me. "I didn't ask," she said, voice low. "I didn't ask when I brought you here either," I answered. She gave the smallest flicker of a smile, almost invisible, but it reached her dark eyes for the first time. We ate without many words. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen fields, but inside there were two people breathing, instead of one. From then on, the day settled into a rhythm I had never known. Maella still slept in the shed, but she began to move through the yard like it was partly hers. She carried armfuls of firewood before I could reach for them. She scattered grain for the chickens and collected the eggs without being asked. One afternoon I came back from the south pasture to find she had mended the torn harness on the plow and stacked the loose stones that had fallen from the barn wall. Each task was small, quiet, almost invisible, yet every one left a trace of her hands. I never thanked her out loud. She never expected it. We simply passed each other in the yard, nodding once the way people who are learning to share space do when words still feel dangerous. One evening, the wind cut sharper than usual. I was sitting at the table mending a bridle when the shed door creaked open. Maella stepped into the main house wearing my old wool coat, the hem brushing the floorboards. She moved slowly as if the invisible line between shed and house still held power. She didn't go to the farthest corner. She sat on the chair closer to the hearth, closer to me than she had ever sat before. Neither of us spoke. I kept working the leather. She held a cup of hot water between her palms, letting the steam rise against her face. The fire popped softly. Outside, the wind beat against the walls like something trying to get in. After a while, she slid the wooden cup across the table toward me. "I'm not thirsty," I said. I know she answered. "But your hands are cold." I took the cup. The warmth moved from my palms into my chest deeper than any fire could reach. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other across the table, the light from the hearth catching the faint green of her skin and the small chipped tusk at the corner of her mouth. No thanks passed between us, no promises, no questions about tomorrow. But in that quiet, the house that had stood empty of any other living soul for so many years finally felt like it belonged to two people. And for the first time since I had carried her out of the snow, I realized I did not want it any other way. The confrontation came on the day the snow finally stopped falling. The sky hung low and heavy, pressing down on the fields like a sheet of lead. I had just finished repairing a section of fence when I heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Maella was already standing on the porch, her body-tense eyes fixed on the road. She had sensed it before I did. Rovek Hale did not come alone. 3 riders stopped at the gate. Rovek sat in the middle on a large gray stallion, his black fur-lined cloak making him look even larger. Flanking him were two hard-faced men hands resting near the hilts of their knives. Rovek's eyes scanned the yard before locking onto Mila. The smile he gave was cold and possessive. "I gave you a chance to be reasonable in town," he called out, his voice carrying across the frozen yard. I stepped down from the porch and stood beside Mila. She didn't hide behind me this time. She stood shoulder to shoulder with me, her chin lifted, the faint green of her skin catching the weak daylight. One of her small tusks caught the light as she breathed. "I also gave you a chance to turn around and leave my land," I replied. Rovek laughed once short and sharp. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching in the snow. His two men stayed mounted, watching like hounds waiting for a command. "You think a lone farmer with a few thin cows can keep what belongs to me," he said. "She doesn't belong to anyone," I said. Mila's voice cut through the cold air, clear and steady. "I am not yours, Rovek." Rovek's smile faded. He took a step closer to the low fence. "You forget your place, Orc," he said. "I paid good coin for you. You ran. Now I've come to collect my property." Mila took one step forward, then another, until she stood right at the edge of the yard, only the fence between her and the man who had once owned her. Her hands were trembling, but her voice did not waver. "I am not property," she said, loud enough for her words to carry across the open fields. "Not yours, not anyone's. I choose to be here. I choose to stay with Garen." The words hung in the cold air. From the neighboring farms, a few doors had opened. People were watching, Rovek noticed. His jaw tightened. "You would choose this?" he sneered. "A broken-down farm, and a man who will tire of you by spring." Mila's hands clenched at her sides. I could see the effort it took for her to keep standing there, facing the man who had beaten and sold her like livestock. "Yes," she answered. "I choose this." I moved to stand directly beside her, close enough that our shoulders brushed. "She stays," I said loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is her home now. If you want her, you'll have to go through me, and you'll have to do it in front of the whole town watching." Rovek looked around at the growing number of eyes on him. Forcing a woman off a man's land in private was one thing. Doing it publicly while she declared her choice was another. The balance had shifted. He spat on the ground. "You'll regret sheltering this trash," Miela answered before I could. "No," she said, her voice breaking slightly but strong. "For the first time in my life, I am exactly where I want to be." Rovek stared at her for several long seconds. The wind moved across the yard, stirring the thin snow at our feet. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and jerked the reins hard. His men followed without a word. The sound of hooves faded down the road. The yard became quiet again. Mila stood still, breathing hard. I could see tears on her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. When she finally turned to me, her dark eyes were wet but clear. "I'm shaking," she admitted quietly. "So am I," I said. She gave a small broken laugh. Then she looked back at the house behind us, the wooden walls, the rising smoke from the chimney, the open door. "I will stay," she whispered more to herself than to me. "Not because I have nowhere else to go. Because I want to." I nodded. Good. That night, for the first time, Mila carried her few belongings into the main house and set them down in the room across from the hearth. She didn't ask. She simply chose. I watched her from the doorway as she folded the blanket I had given her and placed it on the bed. The firelight caught the faint scars on her wrists and the chipped edge of her tusk. She moved like someone who had finally decided the door was no longer a cage. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. "Miela," I said. She turned. I crossed the room, until only the width of the table stood between us. "Hi, Jen. Song voi toi." I said again, the words clear and certain this time. "Not until the snow melts. Not until you're strong again. Stay. Live in this house with me. As long as you want. This is your home now." Her breath caught. For a long moment she simply looked at me, the firelight dancing across her face. Then she gave the smallest nod, the kind that carried years of weight behind it. "I will," she said. And in that quiet answer, the house that had stood empty of any other living soul for so many years finally became something more than just mine. It became ours. The confrontation ended on the day the snow finally stopped. Rovek and his 2 men were already at the gate when Mila and I stepped out onto the porch together. The gray sky hung low over the fields, but the air felt sharper, clearer, like the world itself was holding its breath. I could see faces at windows and doors along the neighboring farms, people watching, silent, the same people who had once stood in a circle and called her trash. Rovek sat tall on his gray stallion black cloak, flapping in the wind. His men flanked him, hands near their knives. He looked at Maella like she was still something he owned. "I came to take back what's mine," he said, voice loud enough for the whole yard to hear. Maella didn't hide behind me. She walked forward until she stood at my side, shoulder to shoulder, her dark hair lifting in the cold breeze. The faint green of her skin caught the weak daylight. One chipped tusk gleamed as she breathed. Her hand brushed mine for a single second, steady, not trembling. "I am not yours," she said, her voice carrying across the frozen ground. "I was never yours. I choose to stay here, with Garen. This is my home now." The words rang out clear and final. No one in the watching houses moved. Rovek's smile twisted into something ugly. "You think these people will protect you?" he sneered. "They called you trash on the road. They'll call you trash again the moment I'm gone." Mila lifted her chin. "Let them hear it," then she answered. "Let every person in Briar Fen hear me say this. I am not trash. I am not property. I am staying because I want to stay." She stepped down from the porch and walked straight to the low fence, stopping only a few paces from Rovek's horse. I moved with her close enough that our arms touched. The wind moved across the yard, stirring loose snow at our feet. From the houses, more doors opened. More eyes watched. Rovek looked around and saw the same thing I did. Too many witnesses. Too many ears that would remember. He spat on the ground. "You'll regret this, Holt." I met his eyes. "She stays. Get off my land." For a long second, nothing moved. Then Rovek jerked his reins hard, turned his horse, and rode away. His men followed without a word. The sound of hooves faded down the road until only the wind remained. Maella stood there, breathing hard. Tears slid down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. When she turned to me, her dark eyes were wet, yet bright. "I said it out loud," she whispered, "in front of everyone. You did." She looked back at the house, the wooden walls, the chimney smoke rising, steady, the open door waiting. Then she looked at me again. "I'm not running anymore." That evening, after the last light had bled from the sky, Mila carried the few things she owned from the shed into the main house. She didn't ask. She simply chose. I watched from the table as she folded the blanket I had given her and placed it on the bed across from the hearth. She hung her cloak on the second hook by the door. She set her small wooden cup beside mine on the shelf. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the world was quiet under fresh snow. I didn't speak much. Neither did she. We didn't need to. Words had already done their work that day. Later, when the house had grown warm and the wind had settled, she sat across from me at the table with a cup of hot water between her hands. The firelight moved across her face, softening the scars on her wrists and the chipped edge of her tusk. For the first time since I had lifted her from the snow, she looked at me without the shadow of fear in her eyes. "They won't call me trash again," she said quietly. "Not to my face. Not while I'm standing beside you." I reached across the table and rested my hand near hers. Our fingers didn't touch, but they were close enough. "You don't have to stand alone anymore," I told her. She looked at our hands, then at the room around us, the room that had been mine for so many lonely years and now held 2 people. 2 breaths, 2 lives, learning how to share the same space. "I know," she said. We sat like that for a long time, the fire burning low, the house quiet except for the soft pop of wood and the faint sound of our breathing. No grand promises, no rush to name what this was. Only the simple, steady truth of two people who had chosen each other when the world had tried to throw one of them away. Outside the town of Briar Fen slept under the snow. Inside the house that had once felt too empty now felt exactly right. Mila was no longer the orc woman they had called trash on the roadside. She was the woman who had stayed, and I was the man who had finally stopped living alone.